So we've been working on questions of domestic life, the home, memory, for several years now through a project called Modern Living that has been performances and films cited in modern homes. And from Modern Living, we created a performance score called Clockwork that's been presented in many different situations, different different spaces. But I think that the experience of this kind of post-COVID reality that we're all experiencing, that has put many of us more in our homes, and also with more of kind of consciousness of our spatial relationships to one another, has kind of re-informed the work with new questions about the daily life, how to create meaning out of the small details of the daily life. I think that's probably the way that COVID has most impacted this practice.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the experience of the pandemic definitely has created throughout the world this sense of before and after, and we are in the after. So it did something to our understanding of time as history. And then I think that it's also forced many people to slow down, not really by choice. So, and I'm very interested in how this might inform performance in a very formal and structural way. And I find myself very interested in the non-event, in static, which doesn't necessarily mean that time is still. It's always moving and elastic, but it's not structured necessarily by drama or the event. So I've been thinking a lot about that because we are in a major global event right now. So what is the non-event within that? And I think the work has also led us to think about the daily activity, quotidian activity, movement, memory, speech, that is more everyday. I know this is not very new in art, but there was something I read here by Pessoa, the famous Lisboan poet, where he says, "Bring all that you are into the least that you do." And it's from a poem. And I found that to be very resonant with not only what we're exploring in this workshop, but also how we are going to live through this time, which is very challenging.
Well, we have a tendency in our work to kind of create projects inside of projects, and it gets very confusing even to us sometimes, but there's something about that confusion that I think is productive. So we did have an exhibition called Clockwork, and inside of Clockwork we created a performance artwork also called Clockwork, which was a score that we used in our performances of Modern Living, site-specific performances in various modern houses. So we kind of extracted this score, which we created for very practical reasons. Modern houses are very small, and we needed to figure out how to move inside of them. So the basic idea of the clock, that you have 12 movements, each movement associated to the number on the face of a clock, as if you are in the center, creates a very small unit, just the length of your appendages. So we created it for these houses and then developed it into its own autonomous work, which now we've presented, yes, first at Pioneer Works, at Le Corbusier's apartment in Paris, and recently at the MAMCO in Geneva. So that's the strange and wonderful labyrinth of that work.
And I think that what is kind of consistent throughout the performance score, the work, Clockwork, the exhibition, Clockwork, is of course this exploration of time. And oftentimes exhibition in architecture is thought of as space and the temporal element is forgotten. But we've been thinking a lot about the time of exhibition. Of course, in performance and dance and theater, we're always thinking about time. I mean, we're kind of like time artists in a way. But in visual art, there's also time. I mean, there is the time of an exhibition. There is the time of the museum day. There is time as in history. There's memory. And I think specifically with Clockwork, which is a score, which is really at the heart of it is for two people. So we're also interested in how this idea of like if each of us is a clock, like two clocks, and how those clocks don't necessarily have the same temporality or same rhythm or same sense of time. And a major work that was really impactful when we were developing Clockwork is this classic work by Felix Gonzalez Torres called Untitled Perfect Lovers, Untitled parentheses Perfect Lovers, which is two clocks side by side on a wall, which begin synchronized, but inevitably over time they become out of sync, they fall out of sync, because that's what happens with our machines. So that work, that project is really kind of within the legacy of works that we were thinking about when we made this score, Clockwork.
I think that the work we've been making for 10 years has really focused on this question of intimacy, relationship, and how kind of it's in those one-on-one or very small encounters with each other that the larger questions of society and history are asked and activated. So even in State of, it's the idea of like, okay, you want to address questions of racial difference and national identity, and how do you do that? I mean, we're not policymakers. That's a different kind of way of addressing those questions. So we think about the performance as this kind of space where people get close to each other, even the performers. And if you create a frame for it, those questions come up and they become the material of the work. Maybe they even become what gets worked through in the process. So I think we're already always thinking about performance as this kind of technical support for social relations, for relationships. In the work, in Clockwork, it becomes even more specifically about time and memory, and where our memories overlap, where they diverge, how we can find a shared sense of time when we're kind of on our own. It gets to maybe a reflection on those very structures of intimate encounter themselves.
Yeah, and I think that one of the questions that might be being posed by the project, by the work, both for the performer and for the spectator, is how might memory and intimacy as two practices that we all have experience with. Most people, everybody does. They're kind of universal experiences. But how might they be resistances to the speeding up of capitalist time or organized time, or the time of spectacle, or the time of normativity, meaning that you're supposed to go to bed at this time, or you're supposed to experience this at this time in your life? And how might the practice of doing clockwork make us aware in our bodies of how we are not necessarily in sync with this larger machine that is operating through our bodies. So it was really practices of resistance and learning how to live with these systems that might be structuring our time, and taking the time back is a way of resisting. I think in how we do that is through memory, through intimacy, through rhythm, and through movement.
So the workshop is called Practices for Keeping Time, and clockwork, the score, we approach it inside of this workshop, but we also are approaching some other practices, some of which are new to us. And we've been really enjoying working in this vaunted and haunted space. In fact, this morning I was looking at some of the videos, the films online of Pina Bausch rehearsing with the Wuppertal Theater in space, and it's very exciting. It reminds me of the old Martha Graham studio in Manhattan, which has now been destroyed. But you would walk in, and embedded in the wood and in the walls and soaked into the floor is
And the smell.
It's the spirit of history of performance. So it's been exciting to do this work, this practice for keeping time in a space that has kept so much time in its armature, So how that will become a project, I'm not 100% sure, but it's exciting to work in a space that's so embedded with history to do these practices.